Well, as the last few members trickle in, or not, I certainly want to welcome everybody here to the last panel of the day. I did have lots of jokes teed up about closing out the day, but of course, due to the weather change, we're not the last event of the day, so at least we have that in our favor. This panel is titled Emerging Opportunities and Threats Panel. It is certainly never easy going late in the day, but I'm certainly confident that your time will be well spent here today. And your endurance rewarded with the insights and the expertise offered by the panel members sitting here on my left, who I'm excited to introduce. Not in any particular order by seating here, but alphabetical in case you want to follow along in the conference program should you choose. I'd like to introduce the panelists now. I'll start with Todd Klein sitting in the center here. Todd is a principal at Booz Allen Hamilton, where he focuses on the intersection of emerging technologies, government policy, and institutional culture. He's a 23-year veteran of the U.S. Navy, serving in the Judge Advocate Corps as a legal advisor across a very wide and a diverse range of sensitive assignments, everything from Naval District Washington and Carrier Strike Group 15 to Camp David, Assistant General Counsel of the National Security Agency, and Senior Legal Advisor to Naval Special Warfare Development Group. He's taught law at the U.S. Naval Academy and deployed multiple times around the world to just about every geographic combatant command, from Middle East and Africa to East Asia and the South Pacific. However, don't let all that legal stuff fool you. Some of the current areas of focus that he's prepared to speak on and that we talked on earlier in the week are in spatial computing, cognitive processing optimization, and other analytic and algorithmic related topics that will likely arise in this topic. Dave DJ Smith, sitting down on the far end there, is a senior technical surveillance agent and unmanned aerial and counter-UAS systems program coordinator for the Virginia State Police. He's worked in the areas of covert, technical, and tactical surveillance for more than 30 years, and his areas of specialty include, and keep in mind this is not a comprehensive list, GPS installs, technical surveillance countermeasures, mesh node deployments, surreptitious lock bypass and safe penetration, cellular tracking and geolocating, covert surreptitious audio-video deployments, small UAS and counter-UAS deployment operations, and Title III intercepts. DJ, you're going to have to tell us what that is. Although, wait, I actually feel like most of that's classified, and we might need a non-disclosure agreement at the end of this. So, Nathan, if you and the team can have those forms ready for us to sign when we finish here, we'd appreciate that. Yeah, thank you. I also warn you, my wife reminds me all the time I'm nowhere near as funny as I think I am, so don't laugh, it'll only encourage me. Chuck, sitting here immediately on my left, is also joining us today. He is the Director of Operations and Vice President for Advanced Air Mobility Solutions at Universal Solutions International Incorporated. He's also the Vice President for the Association of Uncrewed Vehicle Systems International Hampton Roads Chapter, better known by its acronym AUVSI. Chuck is an experienced leader in science and technology management, test and evaluation, and program management. His background includes leadership roles as an Army Acquisition Corps officer, experimental test pilot, and chief of flight test for the Aviation Applied Technology Directorate. His expertise spans leading rapid prototyping test programs across multiple, highly modified R&D aircraft and advancing the Army Special Operations Aircraft MH-47 Golf Block II acquisition program, brings a strong technical and operational perspective to the evolving landscape of advanced air mobility and homeland security. I mean, gosh, it's a pretty deep expertise of panel members here. So I'm privileged to kind of be up here on the stage, and I think the less talking I do and the more they do, the better we'll all be here in the room. As already mentioned, this is the Emerging Opportunities and Emerging Threats panel. I think about that title, and it kind of offers a bit of a bipolar kind of focus here. And I'm interested to see where we'll end up, whether optimistic, thoroughly depressed and concerned, or maybe somewhere in the middle. Regardless of the outcome, I'm confident you'll be better informed, certainly if the resumes of the panel members are any indication. I think for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to tee up with the emerging threats side of the discussion. But before we get into that, I think it might be appropriate, and something that kind of came out in one of our preparatory discussions before we started, about discussing emerging versus evolving. Todd, if you don't mind, I think if I recall, or maybe if I don't, I think you drew out that nuance about, is it evolving threat or is it an emerging threat, or maybe both?
No, sure.
Could you expand on that idea?
Sure, I can certainly try. So I think we've heard a lot of talk today about a variety of threats and technologies that we need to pay attention to, from sophisticated to a little more mundane. And it's the latter part, I think, that I will focus on most of my comments. But example of an emerging threat, cyber is not an emerging threat. It's an evolving one. It's been around for quite a while, right? It's growing in sophistication as the technology proliferates and becomes cheaper, and folks grow up within a skill set that does not take a huge leap to become illicit in their actions. The difference between the computer I grew up with and then the tech sophistication of my children and what they can pull off with my own iPhone, and that I didn't even know it was capable of, which is scary. So I think that's a little bit of the nuance. Is I think we tend to sometimes focus on a new threat being technically more dangerous just because it's new, and there's elements of where it's not understood, whereas you have others that are evolving, that they have been around for a long time, but their potential lethality or their ability to disrupt is just increasing, but yet we have to come up with new ways to combat that which has already existed. And so then briefly, what a lot of my focus has been on, in fact, is not the sophisticated threats that exist out there, but almost the reemergence of the mundane, where a transition, shall we say, between a 9/11 based Al-Qaeda threat, which required an enormously complex organization that was incredibly well funded, went through a variety of training and planning, and executed that plan over several years that culminated in a spectacular attack against the United States. Over the last 2 decades, I would argue that that has shifted into much more of a mundane element, where crude methods are employed to great effect, and the ability for one person to either be lethal or disrupt has simply increased. That does not mean that we don't require, in fact, we do require incredibly sophisticated technologies to thwart that, but one shouldn't confuse the sophisticated solution with requiring a sophisticated problem set. In fact, sometimes the simplest things are the easiest to disrupt, as illustrated, I think, this morning and then throughout the afternoon, with the fact that some of our largest energy disruptions in this country came from 1 or 2 people firing a weapon. That's not sophisticated, but it requires a sophisticated response.
So I appreciate you speaking on that, because I'm going to acknowledge now that our conversation is going to address both evolving and emerging threats, and we're going to kind of, I think, stray back and forth well inside those lanes. So I appreciate you speaking on that. With the deep unmanned and uncrewed aerial systems, UAS and counter UAS expertise of a number of our panel members, plus how close to home this subject is, not only in the previous panels that we've I've heard discussed today, but also with the overflight of Langley Air Force Base back in December of 23, and certainly the national attention in 24. I think that's a nice place to kind of start this panel today. For this first topic, DJ, I'm going to throw this question down your way on the end there. Could you speak with what you're seeing at the Virginia State Police level? And maybe Chuck kind of speak on that, build on that with the evolving nature of the U.S. threat UAS threat on infrastructure security.
Yeah, so this past December, we dealt with a lot of things we dealt with the last 2 years, which were drones that were not able to be detected, even by some of our more sophisticated systems. The other issues centered around our TTPs and CONOPS. We realized there were some gaps 2 years ago in our ability to respond. So one of the first the first layer of any counter UAS system really is education. And a lot of the conversations I've had in the last couple of years center around that. So the more we educate the public, we start to remove that careless, clueless element from the number of drones we're dealing with. So if we can actually remove that, it starts to narrow the haystack, so we can focus on the dark and the criminal and the careless, or the other type of criminal terroristic use of drones. So the trends we're seeing in Virginia are pretty much the same thing we've seen forever. Our biggest problem in working with our folks in New Jersey this year with the problems they started experiencing was, once it becomes public, then everything becomes a nail. So then, our division commander of our Homeland Security Division, Austin White's in the back, and the other folks are back there. They'll explain to you, when that went public in New Jersey, we started seeing more drone sightings that were always there. We just never looked for them. And that was the case in Langley the last 2 years. you know, Langley's situated in an area where there's a BMX park in Hampton and there's a park in Poquoson where people fly drones on a regular basis, you know, for fun. I mean, they're hobbyists. That's all they want to do. They want to go out there and have fun. Well, most of the military bases, they don't look past the fence line because they have no need to look past the fence line. Plus, their authority doesn't take them past the fence line. So one of the things we're trying to do in addressing that, we just embarked on a project with VIPC, which is another state agency, to layer the Hampton Roads area with sensors, low to mid-level airspace sensors, so that we can quantify the airspace. Because if you can't quantify the airspace, you can't move a lot of the advanced air mobility projects forward in a meaningful way. So one of the trends we're seeing is just drones that are in frequency bands that most of the cataloging systems are not looking for. So if you're not sniffing for that drone via frequency, echo, or acoustic signature, or any other things that we use in these cataloging systems, you're not going to see it. So a lot of our counter UAS systems now, and have always had the ability to ingest a signal, classify it on the fly, and then put it in the system as a threat, so when it shows up again, we know it's there. Because the big thing we have to know is when it's there, where it's at, and what it's doing, and what it's classified as. So those are the questions we got to answer. And let me just say right before we start this conversation too deep, counter UAS really is a misnomer. We are not counter to UAS. It's really, whether at the federal level they call it DTI, detect, track, identify, or detect, track, classify is what I always use at the SLTT level. We're trying to be able to know something's aloft in the airspace so that if we know it's there, that we can actually develop our TTPs and CONOPS to deal with the pilots and educate or take action against them. But the trends we're seeing around the military bases, whether it be New Jersey, South Carolina, Florida, North Carolina, we have an East Coast working group now of all the states on the East Coast and a couple in the Midwest that dealt with this problem. From a federal standpoint, we're all kind of talking, doing tabletops and talking similarities in drones, similarities in flight patterns, similarities in conceptual operations that these drones are flying, help all of us deal with that problem from an upfront approach. So whereas we may see 3 drones in New Jersey, 3 drones flying in Virginia, that's a commonality that we want to know if there's 3 drones flying. If it's 1 drone, it's a lone wolf like we talked about a second ago. Lone wolves are something completely different. One of the things we had to figure out really quickly with Langley was a lot of it was just people that were curious. So again, careless and clueless. But they didn't know they couldn't fly over, and it's not restricted airspace. So when you throw into the factor that from the legislative standpoint, we don't have the ability to actually decode all signals from drones. So we use things like D-drone trailer that we have with the Virginia State Police. The D-drone trailer is what we call SLTT compliant. It's very limited in its scope and ability to actually scan the sky and see what's out there. It'll detect about 150-ish RF signatures for drones, but it won't track them through the airspace. It'll just say, hey, I have a known frequency here that's usually consistent with a Futaba controller or whatever the case is. So we'll know it's there, but that doesn't help us track it through the airspace and where's it at. So that becomes problematic. And we'll talk about legislative issues later, I guess, but that's kind of where we're at with the issues in Virginia. Same exact issues New Jersey had. How do we address the issue? How do we get boots on the ground? How do we make sure our folks that are responding to these drone incidents, respond to it legally and safely? Because as you know, if I walk up to you as a pilot and I jerk the controller out of your hand, they see that as storming the cockpit of a 747. If I shoot your drone out of the sky, it's illegal. It's the Aircraft Sabotage Act. I can go to prison for that. I don't necessarily align my beliefs with that same thought pattern. It's just the way the law is written and the way it's articulated. So we have to make sure our sworn people right out the gate know what they can legally and safely do with a drone pilot, either educate or deal with, and also what the drone pilot's responsible to give them upon request to law enforcement, which is your trust license, Part 107 license, and your registration for your aircraft, unless you have a Maverick Mini or something below the half pound, 0.55 pounds. So education is the centerpiece that, at least through this conversation, you'll hear me come back to. It's the one lacking piece we have across the country. Who here has ever heard of remote ID? Who's ever seen the letter R in the alphabet before? All right, we'll start low. Look, I played football in college. I started low in my classes and worked my way up. So remote ID was a requirement that came out of the federal government that stated you have to squawk who you are, where you are, and what you're doing, okay? Not what you're doing. So the problem with that is we did pass a law that will help narrow the haystack, but there's been no national campaign to educate the average citizen. You can buy a drone on Amazon, charge the batteries, put it in the air. You have no idea you have to comply with licensing, registration, or remote ID. So there's this huge mound, I call it, of the intelligence, the education piece, that if we don't start willowing that down, and that's what we can control at the SLTT level in critical infrastructure. We can control the education piece. We can put signs up and educate the public, which over time will actually help the overall problem. And I probably went long on that, I apologize. But that's kind of what's been going on here.
Chuck, anything that you want to add to that?
Well, I'd like to circle back to the emerging threat conversation. Can a new strategy or new tactic be an emerging threat?
Absolutely.
So, for example, we already talked about the New Jersey incident. So, for psychological or economic disruption, drones that initiate misinformation, panic, the public, and even disrupt, commerce. So we saw in New Jersey, there was a little bit of panic, and that was actually, ended up being an approved test. So they weren't trying to do anything. But just think if someone wanted to do something more, they'd probably fly differently and more harassingly. So I just wanted to pick that out as
No,
well.
I'd agree with that because the effects can change, right? Where it becomes a different threat. Again, not to circle back to 9/11, but I mean, obviously, what everybody remembers is the horrible loss of life that day. But another follow-on effect of that was that airplanes didn't fly for 5 days, which had enormous economic ripple effects when you stop movement. Now, whether or not one could argue that was an intended effect of the attacks, it was certainly a one that cascaded for months, and could argue that certain industries didn't even necessarily recover quickly because they run on such fine margins. So from, I would say that is an emerging threat from the economic disruption that was maybe targeted at something that wasn't as intended.
Okay, thank you.
What about technology proliferation? And where I'm thinking about this is it's a commonly asked question about watching technology advances with the use of drones on the battlefields of Ukraine. I think about proliferation in a couple of different ways. One are technology, advancements, rapid advancements in the scale of crisis, in Ukraine, but also technology proliferation from in echelons from state to non-state actors, from the availability of what used to be high advanced levels of technologies that have migrated all the way down to individual users, the ability to control multiple drones, that kind of technology becoming something that an individual user now has access to. Thoughts on that as an emerging or perhaps an evolving capability?
And when I look at that, I look at 5G, drones flying by 5G. I think it's excuse me. So it gave the ability for a foreign actor or a foreign country to come to here, drop a couple drones on a couple rooftops, fly back to their country of origin, and launch them remotely. So the example I use is the Atlanta bombing. So the Atlanta bombing was predicated on one bomb exploding. When public safety gets on the scene, it's exploding the second bomb. Thank the Lord that the second bomb did not explode. But now you don't have to worry about planning 2 bombs. You just launch one drone, fly it, launch the second drone at a predetermined flight path that it's going to fly its mission. So the issues with the 5G is if you can jam the cell signal, that's great. But if you cannot, it's flying an autonomous flight. Jamming and defeating is now taken out of the layered system of the counter-UAS approach. So you got to go straight to kinetic. And kinetic is the one area it's problematic for Congress and everybody else around the country because they fear that what goes up has to come down, and they worry about the kinetic effects that it's going to have when it hits the ground. But there are soft cyber takeover technologies out there that actually work very effectively. I've been to several demos with Northrop Grumman, Boeing, and a couple other companies that are actually putting this technology to use, and they can actually grab the drone, freeze it in space, and either let it sit there till the battery dies, if it's in a safe area, or fry it to and land it at a predetermined location. I think that's the most equitable counter-UAS mitigation tool that will come to the SLTT and critical infrastructure. I think knocking things out of the sky, net systems are about 40% effective. Has anybody ever seen the Hawk that they trained to grab drones out of the air at the cost of about $250,000 per Hawk that only does it 4 times? And after that, he's like, yep, I'm not doing this anymore because there's no more food involved. So there's plenty of things out there, but technology is rapidly growing when it surrounds. It's the fastest growing technology in the world right now, US is. And it has a lot to do with, just like you said, the Ukraine-Israeli war. They've taken a technology and they stressed it to other uses that were not intended for its use. And now it's a very effective, I think 85% of the deaths in the Ukraine war are attributed to drones. So when you start looking at that, it's a very effective tool. And not to mention, it's a very low entry cost. So you've got a high yield device that's very low entry. And it's one that concerns me here in the U.S. a lot. But sorry, I don't know if I digressed off that or not.
Todd, I want to switch subjects just a little bit. We've talked about drones as both an emerging and an evolving threat. In our preparatory call, we also talked about kind of the role of information and misinformation. And I'm wondering if you could kind of expand upon that as well.
Certainly, and I think it's a fine line we're talking about, right? As you noted, what appeared to be a dichotomy in the topic title of the opportunity, opportunity presented by a threat, right? But at the same time, because the technology, to a certain extent, exists in some format on both sides. But in this particular case, the flow of information, and one of the problems I think law enforcement or anyone who's in the security realm, whether they're trying to secure a facility, whether it's infrastructure in general, is a large problem they have is volume. And for me, that's the volume of data. So to continue our trend of noting terrorist attacks across the years, the Boston bombing was a watershed moment in law enforcement between federal and state for the information that it generated in the hours and days following it. You had, for the very first time ever, you always had tip lines, right? But you had an influx of your standard calls to 911 saying, hey, I think I see something or something like that. Then you also had a flurry of texts via social media, which was just catching on primarily at that point with Facebook. And then you had the absolute game changer is that, 85% of the crowd had a camera in their hand with the ability to transmit an optical image instantaneously. But did law enforcement have the ability to sort through that volume and flood of information with anything but their hands and eyes? And the answer was actually yes, but it was very, very nascent. And facial recognition, optical imagery, identification, we call, especially early computer visioning played a key role in that. But what it showcased a need for now is that this was in a new world where law enforcement had always been overwhelmed by tips during an emergent crisis, but this took it to an entirely new level where it was not just sorting through that, but it was trying to sort through multiple modes of that information. But yet, that challenge then presents an opportunity because within that volume of information was the critical information that was required to crack that case and lead to the termination of one of the suspects and the apprehension of the second one. But it's a challenge that has only grown in the years since as the volume of information that each of us produces individually just increases exponentially, which is another interesting, like if you carry one of these around, you don't care about privacy, you're a hypocrite. So it's just absolutely true. Your stuff's out there, everything you serve. But with that, it presents the opportunity for tech innovation because the requirement typically drives the innovation, and that's the machine learning, the large language models, which enable us to filter through information that would take eons for a human to get through, because none of our agencies, whether that be on the energy side, the law enforcement side, DoD, are going to hire their way out of this problem. So they need an efficient way to go through it, because the great fear we have now is, if you've ever been involved in investigations, searching for the smoking gun, that evidence is out there, I just got to find it. The fear now is that we have the evidence in our data stores and we don't know it. And then if we do know it, we can't find it. So that's the opportunity side, but it's a volume issue, and big D data needs to be addressed.
What do you think, though, may be the threat posed by artificial intelligence? We talked about large language models, algorithms, as both an evolving capability. I would ask each one of the panel members to address that on the threat side for artificial intelligence.
I think it's a huge game changer when you start looking at things like BriefCam, Raptor software, all that kind of stuff that can actually live process looking for a subject in a crowd. The Boston Marathon was a great example of post-processing video to kind of track them back through the crowds. Capitals and soft target areas where they can actually take video and actually look for a subject based on the intel that he's wearing a certain shirt, pants, or whatever, and to be able to look at that in real time through the cameras and find that person, but also take that person through the crowd as he walks through. So, in the case of the Boston, where they start, where they end up, where they drop, did they meet up with anybody in the meantime when they were processing that? One of the other areas that I think is really critical is some legislation in DC right now with 1631, Peters-Johnson bill, is the national reporting system. We bring up 9/11, and it's a great example I use in a lot of my presentations. Is the one thing that 9/11 taught us is we missed all the small things, and had we been able to see the small pieces, the bigger puzzle would have actually came into picture. And by that I mean bodegas closing, people wanting to learn how to fly planes and not land them, and all the things that would have made that picture look a little bit more visible to us. So our problem right now is we got a great amount of data, whether it's county US systems or whatever. And if you didn't know, D-Drone just went out and actually posted all the sensor data from the ones that are on non-covered facilities. And actually you can see what the data looks like for the last couple of years here in the US and the number of incursions daily from Lance to altitude to everything that they're recording in their systems that are public knowledge. It's a really good, some really good numbers to look at. If you look at ddrone.com, I think it's their website, you can go, it actually shows it. But that data tells us a lot of things. We have a sensor in downtown Richmond. It's been up there since, and if you didn't know, Richmond's the actual urban test bed for all DHS county US testing in the US. We did a test in July of 2022 where we actually deployed 7 different technologies and did 1 full day of mitigation in an urban environment, because most of the technology is tested in a desert or sterile environment where there's no RF, there's no sound floor, there's no muddled reflection refraction issues with buildings and absorption of signals, and I'm boring the hell out of you, I know, but all the things that the urban environment brings to that technology that you don't experience in the desert. So they wanted to take a look at it. Does it detect around high-rise buildings? Are high-rise buildings a problem at 60 feet, 100 feet, 200 feet, whatever the case is? That sensor detects about 350 drones a week. And I need you to understand one thing about that sensor. It's a D-Drone sensor, so it's an aeroscope that's sanitized. It's called an aerial armor, which D-Drone bought years ago. It's a sanitized cyber version of that. So it's only going to detect DJI, which is about 85% of the world market right now, still consistently. So it's detecting that many drones that are DJI. So the cheapos from Amazon, Walmart, and stuff like that people can buy for $60, it's not seeing. So that number is probably about 3 to 4 times that number. Because people aren't going to buy the price points that some of the DJI's are. But although that number is critically important, there's some drones flying as high as 1,600 feet in the city of Richmond, in that 9-mile bubble. Why is that important? Because our med flight, like a lot of other med flights, fly around the west side of 95 into VCU Medical Center, and they land to pick up and drop off patients. Those drones are in the same airspace. I lost 2 good friends in Charlottesville because the gearbox on the helicopter went out. If a drone hits a tail rotor of a helicopter, it's coming down in a violent way. So that's a TTP that we can push off to our aviation guys and say, hey, look, and we're actually looking to embark upon a test with a different company to give them airspace awareness while they're in the aircraft, taking off and landing if drones pop up. But not only that, it tells me where do they launch from? Where are most of the drones launching from? Now I can go to that area. It's a park called Browns Island downtown below the Federal Reserve. A lot of the drones are launching from there because it's a park, right? Hobbyist. So we start putting signs up there. We can start addressing that issue. We did another test July of this past year looking at the same technologies in a lead up to some events coming up in the next couple of years. The same thing. It's a 9-mile bubble. We're able to see all the drones in the airspace. But that not only tells me the number of drones, but it tells me what I need to do to address that issue, to start educating our people, where to go, what to do, where to look, and all that. So that we have inaugurations at the Capitol or large events where it's a large soft target. We know how to actually address those issues. And that's, hopefully I answered the question there, but that's kind of our stake. I mean, data is great. The 1631 has a piece in there. It's a 7-point National Security Action Plan, came out of the White House in April of 2022. Charles Warner and I'm also the Deputy Director for Drone Responders. It's another volunteer job that I didn't need, but for counter UAS. But him and I sat in the White House that day and we actually listened to the briefing, and I was so excited when they said National Reporting System, because an incident that happens in California, and I use the term Nashville because my daughter went to UT, but so, a drone detected at the dam outside of Nashville, or maybe, one of Dominion's facilities here in Virginia, maybe not the same drone, but the same person's caught flying a drone in a way that just is suspicious. We now cannot put that together. And we call that a clue in law enforcement, right? When you can see things that actually in live time. We want to be able to do that. So we've got to take that data, and there's siloed thousands and thousands of hours of data out there that we can't glue together to see commonalities. I will tell you, and I can share this now, but the second week the sensor was up in Richmond, in July of 2022, we detected a drone that the week before was detected in Seattle, Washington. Good chance that drone was maybe a tourist. I'm going to probably guess it probably wasn't. Could have been one of the protesters as well. I'm not sure, but that just shouldn't happen. But that's a clue that we want to be able to piece together from a national security perspective. I'll stop there.
So you hit a good point there. We're talking about the positives and potential dangers, and without kind of going down a deep dive of illicit or nefarious or hostile use of AI, because that's a whole other deep, dark thing we don't need to go down and scare everybody about right now. But it's the correlations. And the correlations within a data set that's allowed to talk to one another. So I work with Homeland Security investigations quite a bit, and we program there, but their ability essentially where one agent is able to upload, example, a series of phone numbers that's ripped off a selector of a cell phone, and the geolocations of where those numbers were called. Agent on the East Coast, completely unrelated case, uploads her case files happen to have a couple these numbers. Unrelated agent in Texas can hit a button, and all the spider web of all those numbers will pop up for them without actually going into each of those person's cases, potentially messing them up, but will enable them to provide an insight into something that might potentially follow up on. So the correlations that a human, even if they had necessarily access, could not see. Other examples would be, as they're going through a large data set, is anybody who's run an incredibly high-end white-collar investigation, they're incredibly painful because it's all paper and it's awful. So you could subpoena 10 years of bank records, and it's going to take the investigators just weeks to even go through those. And that's assuming that you allow for fatigue, that they're going to catch on to what they need to catch on to, they remember what they saw 3 pages earlier if they had any notes. And instead, certain AI models go through that and look for correlations based on feed input from the investigators themselves. 3 times across the 50,000 pages, this one phone number called Matamoros, Mexico, every Tuesday for 3 minutes. Stuff that's suspicious. It doesn't say that that's nefarious. It doesn't say that that, in fact, is evidence. It's not. But then it's up to the investigator themselves to follow up on it. So what it is it's a focusing tool in that regard to find those correlations, and the investigator determines to what extent they're worthwhile, right? Are they weird or not? Computer might say this is just a correlation. Like, no, that happens all the time. I know that, the computer doesn't. But within that, there's a danger, which is the human confidence factor being over-reliant on that, where it finds a correlation and the assumption that there were no other correlations, right? That it only found what you thought it was looking for. There's a lot of folks in here who are perhaps not born in the 2010s, and we all remember that there was, when Word and spell check first came along, right? That you could argue that's an element of machine learning and AI, but it's not going to. Early versions might tell you that there's a mistake, but it wouldn't tell you that you spelled there THEIR when it should have been THERE, and that mistake is in your document. So you didn't get the little red line that went underneath it. You went and turned it in. There was a confidence level that you were wrong on because you didn't check it yourself. Exactly. So there's danger of assumptions that the correlations or something that an AI model points out means there's no other things in there, or that it's 100% right. And so that's where one can become over-reliant on a technology, especially when one is overworked, overtasked, and they have an enormous volume of things they have to get through. And this is a time saver in that regard. When ideally, at the end of the day, the AI model itself should not be about finding the needle in the haystack. It should be about removing the hay. So therefore, what is left is the things that we need to pay attention to.
Good point.
Chuck, thoughts on that as well?
Yes, I'd wanted to speak to that, but the trust issue, which is the same thing as confidence, as AI is asked to do or get more in the loop and make more sophisticated decisions, who decides what that level of trust is, who signs it off? Anyone who's used ChatGPT, you have to be careful what you ask it because it'll give you what you asked for. So almost along the same lines.
Sure.
What about the role of autonomous systems and what level of autonomy should exist, could exist? I mean, autonomous systems aren't new. That is not an emergent threat. That is, or an emergent capability. I won't put it in a bucket of threat or opportunity. Autonomy and autonomous systems have existed for a long time. But what role or what potential exists for increasing autonomy? And I'm thinking about the development and the evolution of large language models into things like large action models. When do we start coding, autonomous steps into autonomous steps, increasing autonomy, and the potential for perhaps runaway autonomy? Thoughts on that?
I think autonomy is probably one of the biggest trends in UAS right now. I had the opportunity to be on a panel in January at the Business Executive Forum in Vegas, and I was on a panel with Roxanne Kennedy, a good friend of mine, and Mark Steinbach, who's the chief of Beverly Hills. So Beverly Hills does 12-hour flights a day. They do DFR flights, just patrolling Beverly Hills, 12 hours a day. In Chula Vista, they couldn't do that because of their community wouldn't have that. So it's autonomous flights. So what you get from an autonomous flight such as that is you get changes in the environment below you. So if anything changes that environment, it can see it. So if you're running an AI algorithm, there are some spookier softwares out there that we use for surreptitious entry, but It can tell you changes within that environment. So fires would be a great example. Anything that changed in the environment from the fires that we're dealing with out there. Autonomous flight for deliveries. Here on the Eastern Shore, we just kicked off, well, I say, VIPC just kicked off a program with Drone Up and some other ones to do medical deliveries of statin medications to people around that hospital on the Eastern Shore. With the overall goal, they're going to actually be doing medical deliveries to Tangier Island. It's about 17 miles out there. Because Tangier Island, for them to get certain medications or do labs and things of that nature at their hospital, they have to send them back to the mainland, have it done, and they have to weigh in the reports and all that stuff. So it changes way. So it basically builds off what they did in North Carolina, which was the first couple autonomous flights they did down there was the lab and the hospital were on opposite sides of the interstate. So they would actually put stuff in a drone, fly it up, over, land, do the lab results, and then they would get it, a few minutes later through the computer system. So we start talking about autonomous flights. There's a company in the Midwest called Saberwing. And I haven't seen them fly their stuff yet, but they can haul allegedly 5,600 pounds, 1,600 miles. So when you start looking at port congestion, port security issues there, so when we had that congestion on the West Coast, I mean, when you can load that much stuff into a autonomous drone and fly it 5,600 miles and land it at a central area like a UPS hub, FedEx hub, or something along those lines, and that's a game changer for all of us. But one thing that came out of COVID, and the last point I'll make that I think was a positive was teledoc visits. You got sick, you hey doc, I feel bad, open your mouth, and you're looking into a computer screen. But if you got a young child that's got an earache at 2 o'clock in the morning, do you want to wait till 9 o'clock when the office opens and sit there for 2 hours with your child being very uncomfortable? Or do you want to jump on a teledoc? Hey doc, this is what's going on, ears red. Yep, I'm going to go and prescribe the medicine. I'll be there in 30 minutes. And then it takes off. You go outside, there's your medicine. You put the child to bed and boom, that's a game changer right there. Or hey, I'm just not feeling good. My husband I think is having a heart attack. There's a defibrillator en route. Be there in 2 minutes or 30 seconds, whatever the case is. Those are all things that are being efforted now. So autonomous flight will take that. And that's where counter-UAS kind of is that crux to that whole system too. If you can quantify the airspace and you can put all that stuff into play tomorrow, but I'll stop there.
And I think it depends. So for me, I'll be candid, AI has almost lost all meaning to me as a term. Because there's so many aspects to it. You really want to be like, okay, we're talking about AI, but what aspect are you talking about? Are we talking about, autonomous systems? Are we talking about machine learning? Are we talking about just a level of analytics over the top of it, or spell check? And in this particular case, I tend to break autonomy into two kind of categories. There's the automatic, where you have, say, a pre-programmed flight where it's just going to follow the coordinates that you put in, or one that's adaptive. So automatic or adaptive, where it's more like get from point A to point B, and then the system itself adjusts its flight path based on objects, based on wind, based on speed, based on a variety of environmental factors. So it's making decisions as to how to accomplish a task versus automatically accomplishing a pre-programmed task. And I mean, there's subtle differences, but those are put together in that regard. And that's where you start getting into kind of the generative AI aspect of it. And so for me, you mentioned at the beginning, so I look a lot at spatial computing, things that in my mind deal with the visual. Maybe it's been a lawyer much of my career, so you believe what you see, even though you really shouldn't. But there's an over-reliance upon that. But a former leader in the FBI described the problem of AI in law enforcement investigations as that when a prosecutor or agent is asked, how did you get this answer? It can't be, I pushed a button on the computer and it told me it. They've got to be able to explain, how that process came to be through the entire thing. So when, I'll just actually save the rest. We'll stop there.
Kind of like a computer, your kid wants to do his math problem. He has to write it out for the teacher, but you figure it out on the computer really quick, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about the business case, for example, the Tangier Island, the medical delivery. Another thing to take in mind is, does it become profitable past the grant funds? Because sometimes it's not scalable and the technology is just not cheap enough to keep it sustainable. And the technology is there to do it, but can it be a business case? So
I think you're right. I think most drone delivery companies are taking a loss right now with every delivery they make. Tom Walker, who owns Drone, tell me a kind of interesting stat I never knew. But if you didn't know, and if you ever get on a trivia show, this will probably make you the millions. But everybody in the U.S., 90% of the population in the U.S. live within 10 miles of a Walmart. So for delivery systems to be profitable, 7.8 miles is that sweet spot they're all shooting for. I think they're about 3 miles now, I believe, roughly for autonomous deliveries. Anybody here from Southwest Virginia, Blacksburg area? All right, well, you can get Wendy's delivered now with the map project they're doing out there. So you can get that small Frosty sent to the house and delivered.
Those are delicious.
That was, that was, they could deliver all the suntan lotion, all this stuff they wanted to, but man, when they started delivering Frosties, I'm all over it, buddy. But yeah, it's scalable. So you're right. Is it profitable? I mean, can the system work to where you actually make a profit? And he was explaining to me at 7.8 miles makes him that sweet spot for profitable. Obviously 10 miles or, 9.8 miles is better, but 7.2 or 7.8, he said. So, and I think that'll be a factor. I think Zipline, I think all the companies that are doing deliveries now are struggling with that, but they're proving out the concept. I just wish our federal partners would actually, take that data they provided and let it expand to scale would be great.
It is happening on the I'd say the first responder side. You mentioned DFR, right? Drone is a first responder, and some of the drone work, especially on autonomous, has been game changers for especially small jurisdictions that can't afford to fly, even own a helo, much less every single time. For those of you who don't, aren't in the aviation world, there's a huge cost benefit analysis to flying any type of aircraft because of the maintenance aspect you have on the back end, assuming you can afford the fuel. So you have a budget. And so every time you have a perceived need to have some type of overhead, or aerial aspect to the operation you're trying to run, it's usually emergent, then you have to be like, okay, if I fly today, that means I probably don't get to fly tomorrow. So if something happens tomorrow, then I can't. So how do you solve for that? Well, one, drones are cheap. Two, a lot of jurisdictions, when they're outside of, say, like a Chula Vista area, especially with that, and that's a nasty flight area down there in general for drones. They fly in, especially slightly rural areas where you have an incredibly resource-constrained emergency responder system, and they can put a drone on target, especially for like a fire call to determine if there even is a fire, and then do they have to even then roll out their fire department trucks and the rest to get there. Additionally, you might have that helicopter, you might have that pilot, but that pilot quits tomorrow. So this we've talked about this like also with the Coast Guard. It takes years and millions of dollars to grow one pilot who can also walk out the door all of a sudden. So what are you left with from a resource investment standpoint? So the business case, it's weird. Like on the like governmental side, it's actually incredibly, I think, valuable. But it's harder on the commercial side. Though I don't know when. I think they're going to fix that.
I think BVLOS, I think Part 108 is going to change it. It's in OIRA now, or was in OIRA. But to that point too, like the DFR programs, that's an emerging technology. So DFR programs, like Chula Vista started out, they have a spotter on the roof that watches the drones. It launches and they have to have a visual observer on the roof. So Pearland, Texas had the first waiver that actually did it with technology. So they use an iris camera and some radar systems, and they actually quantify the airspace using that to deconflict with anything else. So they can actually launch and do what they need to do. So flash forward to this past year, NYPD got a COA to actually do DFR flights up to 200 feet in the city, which to me was amazing. And look, this wasn't even a hard argument. If a helicopter's flying below the roof line of these buildings, they've got bigger problems than a drone flying. Now, that was the argument they made. They're like, look, if there's a drone below these rooftops, a helicopter, there's a lot more problems we've got. So they were able to actually talk to them and explain to them the benefit that would have. So that's every incremental movement helps everybody else. So that actually helped the delivery companies. When they can prove they can do it safely and they get time in the box to do it, they actually proof out the concept to make it happen. But it's an emerging technology, but there's, I think, 4 other programs right now looking to get their COAs to do that with. And it's a game changer. DFR for us has been a force multiplier. When you can put a drone downrange, Chief Kennedy can put a dollar figure, like I said, $2 million they saved in that first year of turning responses around, but also safety to life as well. A couple examples. One, they had a call of a guy waving a gun at like a hot dog stand or whatever, and he's supposedly waving the gun. So they're coming in hot and heavy. Any law enforcement in the room? Does anybody ever watch a cop show on TV? Okay. All right. So, you're rolling heavy. You got a guy with a gun, waving a gun, threatening citizens or whatever. So when they got the drone overhead, which got there like a minute and a half to 2 minutes before the first responding officer did, they see him actually take it and light a cigarette. So now they can push down safer communities, ramp down the response. Now they get there, it's an education, not an interaction, because you're going to come out gun drawn, you don't know what you're dealing with, and that could actually raise the stakes quite a bit. And depending on how dumb the guy wanted to be, does he aim it at the police officer? Then that could have been deadly. But that's a game changer. I brought up the point about Chief Stainback because I'm like, wow, you're doing patrols for 12 hours a day, and they don't do them in nighttime hours because they can't get the waiver to do that with. But like he said, DJ, it's a game changer for us. Mm-hmm. He said because a 911 call comes in, boom, the drone's right there. And he said, not only that, we can feed that video feed to our officers responding, and now they can see what they're dealing with. hostage standoff, or whatever the case is. What am I dealing with? Intel is what we all live by. I joke about our Fusion Center folks here in our Homeland Security Division, but the better intel you have, the better decisions you can make. Streaming video from a drone for us has been huge because now if you got TAC teams in a building, we have 7 full-time TAC teams. Now you can stream that video out. The team leader can make a better decision on how to handle it. It's been a huge game changer, but you also can save you on having enough bodies on the ground to actually do stuff with. And that's been a game changer for us, and I think all of public safety.
DJ, this conversation was centered on kind of the role of the technology advancements that are allowing and making some of the, giving us some of the room for optimism, some of the, increased response times, some of the increased information that allows us to have flexibility in type of response, de-escalation, escalation. Previous panels and some of the discussion there talked about some of the role of regulation that either inhibits or allows for some of this response, some of the kind of the capabilities in this space as well. Chuck, I know that's something you and I had discussed, prior to this panel. I was wondering if you could speak of, the role of regulatory either limitations or, support that allows for security in this space.
Well, I just go back to drones as a first responder, for example. I know the Norfolk Fire and Rescue has a good UAS team, but they have to do what you say they call tactical beyond visual line of sight, so they have to have a spotter. So hopefully the Part 108 regulations, which is the beyond visual line of sight regulations, help enable it. I believe the intent is to make it more structured so people know what to do to get that F-108 standard. For example, if I want to be a pilot, you just go, the FAA tells you how to be a pilot, what you have to do exactly. Right now, they can't tell us what we have to do or exactly for that. So that's why, thus all the waivers and things. Also, there'll be a need for a change in tactics because the first responders are just able to go farther, faster. They'll need bigger drones. So how do they practice? Where do they develop their strategies and tactics? Do they, fly over, over a field or something? So I think they need a place to practice and do that and develop those tactics.
I think that's where the corridor from Stafford, Virginia, up to Winchester, I think it's 70-some miles. They're actually going to start proofing out unmanned aerial systems or uncrewed, like Electra Aero's taxi and some other stuff to fly that path. They're going to put sensors and quantify the airspace so they can actually fly those and actually proof concept, like you're saying. But it goes back to my initial point, which is a win for DFR programs is a win for delivery companies. So when you can prove you can do it in congested airspace or non-congested airspace, delivery companies can then go, hey, I want to go to 4.2 miles, and start incrementally building it out. I will tell you that we are way behind a lot of the world right now when it comes to that, because I think in a lot of cases we overregulate everything. And it's probably not a surprise to anybody in this room, but UK is doing some amazing things with counter UAS and drone detection and airspace awareness. Gatwick, they put a dollar figure. Every minute or 30 minutes that airport's closed. The interstate here in Virginia, if the interstate's closed more than 30 minutes, they have to send a teletype to the governor's office because there's a fiscal dollar figure tied to that loss. And I think that's where we're headed. I think it's going to be huge for everybody. But if we can get DFR and more deliveries and more longer flights for public safety, it's going to benefit everybody.
One of the harder aspects, you mentioned at the beginning, so I spent a lot of time thinking about the intersections of like technology, policy or statute, regulation, and culture. I mean, by culture, I mean institutional cultures, because any one of those can be an incredible force multiplier and really supercharge the other two, or any one of them can be absolutely fatal to the other two. And personally, I found that the biggest barrier is not, you think that it's policy or statute, it's not, it's culture. And the unwillingness to share information that's received. But within that, you still do have policy, regulatory, or statutory issues, and one that has not caught up to it is the availability of open source information to law enforcement, other public safety realms, and then what they're allowed to look at, what they're allowed to collect, what they're allowed to store, and what they're allowed to search. Because as we talked at the beginning a little bit about some of the perhaps changes in attacks, especially on infrastructure and a perhaps element of a lone wolf aspect, is you've also seen a rise almost again like Unabomber style in the manifesto. in that a lot of these clues are present online, if not months, weeks, or even sometimes hours in advance of the actual execution of a purported attack, or quite candidly, the live stream of the actual action themselves. Because one commonality the majority of these people have who perpetrate these is they lack significant decision-making abilities. They don't think through the consequences of their actions, as if they did, we wouldn't have crime. And so with that, though, the decision to make one of these attacks, usually there's a cascade of other bad decisions, and one of those is to live stream your own attack and provide the evidence. But there are policy and regulatory issues that prevent, if not the collection of that type of information that any one of us could view, but the actual sharing of it with the jurisdictions that might need to have it because of the identifiers involved. So that's something that is complicated on both a federal level, it's complicated on a state level, it's complicated on a city level, and sometimes, county as well. It's not new, but because now where information is available, not just in the jurisdiction in which you live, but it's actually available to every person on the planet, that same information, but you lack the tools and a statutory scheme to actually pay attention to it.
We're about 20 minutes out from the panel. I still have a couple of questions I'm going to hold, but I'd like to open the floor up to the audience to see if there's any questions from the members here for our panel members. The silence is as awkward as right when we started and we were waiting for Nathan to tell us to go ahead and start.
I thought she was actually going to ask a
But that's
question.
okay.
She was marching so purposefully.
I
Like,
know,
this is amazing.
that's right. It's great.
And I was wrong.
All right, we have a taker. Excellent.
Thank you all for an excellent panel. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on early lessons learned regarding the numerous drone sightings in the New York, New Jersey area. And what I specifically mean by that is around communication from government authorities. In your view, working these issues day in and day out, what could have been done better by government authorities in terms of communicating with the public around what was actually taking place, what its purpose was, and whether to be alarmed or not?
I'll start. I think one of the lessons learned was sifting through the data and actually, which ones are drones and which ones aren't. If you didn't know, the Starlink satellite system has 12 satellites that'll fly overhead in synchronous orbit, okay? We had a lot of reports in New Jersey, New York, Virginia of the Starlink satellites. There's 12 drones flying overhead in formation right now. One of the lessons we learned early last year, but also came about again this year, was the ability, if anybody's ever used night vision goggles, depth perception is a problem with night vision. The same thing when you're looking up in the sky at night, you can't determine depth or perception of how far that's up in the air. So a plane could look like a drone, but it's probably at 15,000 feet. One of the issues last year at Langley in 2023 was a lot of reports of drones overhead. When you got to look at them, they're at 30,000 feet, but the blinking lights are very visible. Venus, other planets. This year was really weird because we have this weird constellation going on where the planets are aligning and they're very vivid in the sky. And I won't speak for, Lieutenant Todd and some other folks, but a lot of people were out there going, hey, that drone's been sitting there all night long and he's not moving. Well, first of all, the technology's not there yet for something to fly 24/7. Okay, but they're like, that drone's just been sitting out there and it's got a very bright light on it and it's just sitting there in the sky.
No, that's a planet.
It's a planet. So our ability to look for that, and then using some constellation apps, Flight Radar 24, a lot of things that are out there to look and see if it's an aircraft or not. We tried to put that out from the state of Virginia, from the Homeland Security Division. They put together an education card that went out. They worked very hard on that to educate the public on, hey, if you see something, just maybe throw your app out there. Flight Radar 24 will actually show you the sky of the plane if it's a plane. And if it's not, then maybe that ramps it to the next level. Report it. I think the first night we had 70, almost 80 reports the first night when we went public with it. That's a lot of things to go through, but I'll stop there and let you guys answer that one.
Yeah, I think there are some simple proactive things that could be done. For example, those drones in New Jersey, I believe, at least partially, were in national airspace. But there should be a point where certain drone activity is incorporated into the NOTAMs, the notice to airmen that's out gets published. So that's one example of something that could be done and alleviate some of that.
And And DJ, I'm just a panel member, but I think about your comment earlier about the education aspect, the education about the data that we do know about drone usage every day in certain areas, just to kind of frame the context. Hey, these reports have existed, but here's what we know about normal drone patterns, normal drone usage. That really puts into context thousands, tens of thousands of drone operations, drone flights in these areas over time. That to me, I'm a data guy. Understanding that really allows you to to put into context. Okay, these types of sightings really fit in a much broader kind of body of understanding of what's normal.
And the National Airspace isn't closed. We can't regulate the airspace. There were 4 bills in the Virginia General Assembly this year that have all died, but they all centered around, we call it the Huntington Ingalls Bill. Everybody knows the drone incursion we had here at the shipyard in Newport News. Chinese national was found, taking video of some sensitive areas. That airspace isn't restricted. It's not closed. We can't do that. There is something called Section 2209 that's been sitting there since the Reauthorization Act of 2016. That rule is, and I apologize for sounding like I've had a lot of overnighters this week, so I'm about half dead. But if that gets done, then they can petition to have the airspace closed over their facility, which will help us move towards putting more teeth in that. But then again, what's the enforcement arm? Can we enforce it at the state, local, tribal, territorial level? No. So we've got to come to some realizations with that so that we're dealing with this in a fair and equitable way at the SLTT and critical infrastructure level. There's no reason Dominion shouldn't be able to put detect, track, classify systems around their facilities to know something's there. I get it, mitigations is difficult and it's a very contentious issue, but they need to be able to have the ability to know it's there so they can put, I call it put a body on a controller and at least find out why you're here. Why are you flying here? Because that's where the rubber meets the road. If we can get to that point, then we can start efforting the problem and educating the public. But education is everything right now. It's the only thing we can control. We've done an LMS with Virginia on Visual Observer with state police. We put the educational card out to get our 2,800 sworn folks at least up to speed on what drones are and what you can do legally and not create liability for the agency, but also educate the public. Because to be honest with you, most drone pilots have no clue. They have to have a license or register. They just don't know because there's no POS information coming out when they buy the drone that says you have to comply with these things first.
The identification piece, and I know we've heard that a couple times, right? We're like, well, you can identify, but you can't do anything about it, so what do you care? Which is so fundamentally stupid. I mean, it's a check engine light on your car. Can any of us do anything about that either? No, but I'm glad I know what happens.
Yes.
I'm not glad. It's kind of terrible, and I'm really mad about it. But it's much better to know that you have a potential problem and then you start taking steps to address it first, right? And that's a typical, you got to diagnose the issue.
Absolutely.
I'd rather know that I have drones, or more yet, you know what? We don't have any. Okay, so you've got a security posture based on that as well, and then you take extra steps after that. So identification cannot be underrated in any way, in my opinion.
It's the foundation.
100%.
If you don't know it's there, you can't defeat it. So another thing we did, I apologize for adding on to that, but we looked at Virginia code. There's a Virginia aviation code that states you can be charged if you don't have a license for flying an aircraft. The FAA deems a drone as an aircraft. I don't necessarily agree with that, but we're going to take advantage of that posture. They deem registration of an aircraft is illegal in Virginia, 5.1-14, 5.1-13, I believe. So use that code, law enforcement use it. Hi, do you have your license for your registration for your aircraft, sir, ma'am? No, I don't know what you're talking about, and get out of my face. Well, wait a minute, let's have a conversation here because upon request, you have to supply that to law enforcement. So now we can start the education process. Let me explain why you have to have it and then help them get that. So that now that mound of not knowing starts to get smaller and smaller and smaller so that when these authorities do come from DC, we're able to effectively move forward with them and actually make better improvements to how we deal with the drone problem in Virginia. So.
I got a question.
There it goes.
It may be a stupid question, but hey, I'm on to ask.
We're on those stupid questions.
Yeah. Everybody's talking about these drones flying around, and my question is this: have they made a silent drone? I mean, or is it obvious enough that hey, if I hear that little fly or gnat or whatever flying around above me, I can hear it? Or do they make silent drones now?
I'm not sure what you're asking.
I mean, you were talking about people not knowing whether that's a drone or not.
Right.
Elementary would tell me if I can hear it, it's more likely it's a drone. If I can't, then it could be a plane flying
I tell you, when we run ISR operations as an overwatch, at about 150 feet, you can't hear our drone. So it doesn't have to be extremely high. The rotor wash have gotten really good with how they make these the blades. The swoop of the blade and everything else keeps them a lot quieter, so they don't, for lack of a better term, they only did that really to make sure your neighbor didn't get upset at you flying a drone. But you really can't. But the other thing is, spatially, where is it at in the airspace, and can you tell where it's at night? That's the other hard part.
Well, and it depends on the optics on it as well. Skydio makes a pretty high-end, gimbal with an optic on it where you can essentially identify makes and models of vehicles at 5 kilometers. They can see the car, but that car cannot even see that drone 5 kilometers away based on the size. It's the size of essentially, my upper body here. So that's another aspect, is they don't have to be flown close enough, even if they're quiet, for you to notice them and then them to be actually mission effective.
I think most situations you will not hear the drone.
In Rockingham County, we just had a prosecution this past October. First prosecution in Virginia. Mike Shank, the detective, did a great job. We put our D-drone trailer there, and this guy was flying below and actually harassing a lady and her children. So she knew it was there, and we were able to track it, and then we were able to do the forensic dump on the drone afterwards and tie all that together, and he pled guilty to 6 of the 8. But in that case, he was easy. Yep, you're right. We had actually great pictures from the drone trailer of what it looked like. But majority of these drones, especially New Jersey, New York, Virginia, South Carolina, Florida, all the states that had dealt with it, they're like at altitude, some of them at 1,200, 1,500 feet. And you just, other than the lights, you're not hearing anything.
We have time for another question from the audience. Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Erin Burrier. I'm a senior here at Christopher Newport University. I wanted to learn a little bit more about artificial intelligence in your fields, and specifically, we hear a lot about misuse and the unethical use. So I was just wondering how exactly your fields are using AI, and if you're using AI, and then as well as how are you protecting that sensitive data?
I can jump in on that one. So I deal with that a lot. The most unethical use I usually see is the students I teach for a university cheating with it. Yeah. Are these your thoughts? Oh, yes, they are.
Man, I wish they had that when I was in college.
Yeah, I mean, you're using words I've never even heard of before. I'm pretty sure aren't words. It's amazing. No, but on the AI side, so ethical use of AI is a huge thing, right? With guardrails, and so you've seen a lot in the news about the models that they are trained on and the accesses they have to those. One of the issues that I deal with, especially as you move out of that, is the visual models. And so, alluded to it earlier, one of my main focuses is the use of essentially imagery or and being a force multiplier in a security realm where I'm a big believer that your eyes are the most powerful thing that you have, right? And it's the best tool for situational awareness. While there's a reason that if we were all talking in here, it's all super loud. Dr. Bush would get our attention by just flickering the lights, because it cuts through literally everything optically. It literally cuts through the noise. And so the models and imagery to train these, you have to make sure that you are sourcing them ethically and that you have basically lawful authority to look at them. And by simply saying oh, it's open source off the internet, you don't know that, right? It's great it says that and all. And there's you're seeing a couple cases in the news even this week that someone may have done something they shouldn't have and left some text messages internally related to that. But what I try to drive at is the use of that spatial computing in a security enforcement realm, because for me, officer or agent safety is my top priority. And one of them, and you have a cascade without getting into details, like where overwork, burnout leads to poor decision making, personally, professionally, potentially self-harm, and just you can just take it all the way. The stats bear that out. So how do you prevent all of that by making them effective in an industry in which they are perhaps criticized at different times depending on where they're at, right? Is you equip them better. And it's very easy to add more information, but that's not necessarily helpful, right? So I could add a new screen in a command center. That's not necessarily great. They've already got 6. They don't need a 7th one, because any facility, especially on the energy side that you've been a part of, is secure. You have more cameras and screens. You have more screens than people to look at them. And so how do you pay attention to 100% of things 100% of the time with 100% energy? And the answer is you can't. So in that regard, we look at spatial computing, computer visioning to cut through that noise. And if you have, again, 100 cameras but only 7 screens, and they're constantly looking for things, can they be programmed to automatically notice things that are of interest to that specific mission set of that facility, or notice anomalies? So in a particular case, this one person always wearing this type of clothing walks by at 3 p.m. every day. Now, that might be because there's a bus stop right there, or they slow down. they take a picture. And unless you were paying attention to that screen every time and the camera was trained on that and was showing up on there, you would never notice that. But when you have the algorithm running behind that, it flags these things as potential anomalies for then the agent and or human or security official to follow up on afterward. Similarly, you have it where you program it actively to look for things, where you've received some type of INW, a typical, or intel warning that your facility, especially in the case of a secure facility that houses critical infrastructure, is the potential target based on something that came from another agency. But all they know is, hey, driving white pickup truck. The model can be programmed and trained to notice and identify white pickup trucks at distance. That then therefore the officer doesn't have to be like staring at these all day long hoping to notice it, especially if they're even staring at one screen, think large crowd control and all the rest. So dance around a little bit, but it really comes back to the sourcing of it, but then also aligning that with public policy and also statutory sensitivity. So again, I deal primarily on the law enforcement side of things, which means that whatever tool we're using right now has to stand up to judicial scrutiny and a potential prosecution 5 or 6 years from the moment it was used. So we have to future-proof that somehow today, which is super hard, but the best way to do that is to double, triple, quadruple check that its actual construction is already in line with all existing policy and statutory requirements, because someone somewhere is going to have to stand up in court and say, yes, in fact, it did all those things. And the analogy is to as when DNA came online in like the 1990s, and that technology existed, and there was an enormous educational effort through court systems to get juries and judges to admit this even as reliable evidence. That's kind of flipped now, where the technology already exists, but we're not employing it fully in a law enforcement or security tech capacity because we want to ensure that those safe guardrails are there. So in a positive sense, it is being slightly created and maintained, at least within the United States, along with, and some of our Western partners too, to be fair, with our statutory requirements for the ethical sourcing. The concern and pressure doesn't come from the government side, it comes from the commercial side, where the profit desire is there, and shortcutting to get ahead of your dire competitor may cause one to use a model that is unethically sourced. Long answer, sorry.
We have about 2 minutes left for the panel, so panel members, in 1 minute or less each, ending on a high note, emerging opportunity as you look to the future.
Who do you want to go first?
Yeah, something easy here. The Port of Virginia here in Norfolk is a designated a national critical infrastructure site. So an AI-powered drone for port security and efficiency, cargo inspections, early threat detection, and supply chain efficiency is a good use.
Kind of like putting all those things together for the opportunity here is the amount of information that's useful actually exists, and that enables you to get ahead of and thwart equally sophisticated actors who are incredibly adept at hiding in that noise. Obviously there's a concern there, but there's also an excellent opportunity because of the insight that can be gained, the time that can be saved, and kind of going back to the fact that, I'm focused a little more so on the mundane attacks, because in order to attack something from far away, you have to be more sophisticated. If you're using, say, a firearm, the further you are away, the better trained you need to be to use it. Much up closer, it gets a lot easier to hit the target. The same is the sense in long range or nefarious acts like cyber and related, where over thousands of miles you got to be very, very, very sophisticated. But up close, you don't have to be sophisticated, but that doesn't in any way blunt the lethality of it. But the opportunities there to thwart it actually exist because of the manner in which they're conducted. And then some of this, this computer visioning we're talking about, where kind of to build on like Kieran Carroll and what his company does with a human in a loop, but sometimes buying seconds of warning is equal to buying months of warning, depending on what the actual threat is. So in their case, they use computer visioning to identify a potential weapon in, say, a school parking lot, a long gun being taken out of a trunk that's maybe 100 yards out or 50 yards out from the front of the school. The seconds they buy enables that school to go into lockdown before that guy gets there. And so to me, that is a mundane threat that has unfortunately become more prevalent in the United States. But the opportunity now, based on that type of technology and computer vision to thwart it, has, no kidding, made our schools and other facilities that need to be protected more and better equipped at protecting themselves.
All right, so my final thought would be this. 1956, they built the international highway system. Right now, we're facing the same similar pain points with drones and uncrewed systems, unmanned systems, whatever you want to call them. So I think we're at a juncture where we need to start building the highways of the skies to alleviate the same pain points, which are congestion in the airspace. How do we put more uncrewed systems in the airspace in that? So we had a subcommittee hearing last week, and every time I talk to anybody in Congress, I'm like, look, put your money where your mouth is. Every counter-UAS system, detect, track, classify system you invest in clarifies a little piece of that airspace. The more airspace we clarify, the more stuff we can launch. The more stuff we can launch, we have a whole $1 trillion industry that's waiting to take off, for lack of a better reason. So if we approach it from the same way, every time they make an investment in airspace clarity, that helps us with DFR, helps us with deliveries, helps us move advanced air mobility projects forward in a meaningful way. And I'll leave it at that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause for our panel members.